A secret buried in the desert. A girl who was never supposed to survive. And a man who refuses to walk away. When the past won't stay dead, and the truth is more dangerous than the lie, how far would you go to uncover it? This isn't just a fight for survival. It's a war against the unknown. And it's only just begun. The early morning air in Gallup, New Mexico, carried a crisp chill, the kind that lingered just before the sun fully claimed the desert sky. Daniel Hayes adjusted his Stetson hat as he stepped out of his truck. The familiar creak of his worn leather boots against the dry pavement grounding him in a town that had always been home. Yet never felt the same since his return. Gallup wasn't just another dusty pit stop along Route 66. It had history, layers upon layers of it, woven into the red rock formations and the quiet resilience of the Navajo people who had called this land home long before America had drawn its borders. Daniel was one of them, though years spent in Albuquerque's police force had pulled him away from the traditions he'd grown up with. Now, at 50, he found himself back where he started, carrying a badge that felt heavier than it used to. He wasn't the same man who had left all those years ago. Back then, he had a wife waiting for him at home, a partner in life who saw past the stress of the job. But fate had taken that from him one late autumn night. A drunk driver on a rain-slicked highway shattering his world in an instant. After that, Albuquerque had become unbearable, the city's noise a constant reminder of what he had lost. Returning to Gallup had been a way to reclaim some kind of peace. Yet peace was proving to be elusive. The town had changed. It wasn't just the boarded-up shops that once thrived on Route 66's glory days or the new developments creeping in at the edges. There was an undercurrent of unease. A shadow stretching over the tight-knit community. Over the past year, several young women had vanished, Navajo girls. Mostly, disappearing without a trace. No bodies, no ransom notes, no leads, just gone. Daniel had spent months digging, trying to find something, anything, that could lead to an answer. But the town's silence felt like a wall, and every attempt to break through it led to dead ends. Some folks whispered about girls running off to the city, chasing dreams of something bigger. Others hinted at something more sinister, a force lurking beneath the surface that no one wanted to name. He didn't buy into ghost stories, but he knew predators existed, the kind that took advantage of small towns where resources were stretched thin, where people were hesitant to question too much for fear of what they might find. And lately, his gut had been screaming that something was terribly wrong. That feeling grew stronger every time he stopped by Red Rock Stop, a small gas station at the edge of town, run by Walter Briggs and his daughter, Leah. Walter had been in Gallup for over 2 decades, a gruff but generally well-liked man. Leah, on the other hand, had always been a quiet but bright presence, the kind of girl who greeted customers with a polite nod but kept to herself. Lately, though, something about her had changed. She seemed on edge, her eyes darting around like she expected something, or someone, to come for her. Daniel had taken notice. He had a habit of picking up on things that didn't sit right. And Leah's unease had been gnawing at him for weeks. That morning, he pulled into the gas station like he always did, the old Red Rock Stop sign swaying slightly in the breeze, its paint faded and chipped from years of desert sun. He stepped inside, the cool air carrying the scent of burnt coffee and motor oil. Leah was at the counter, her back straight, fingers fidgeting with a receipt. "Morning, Leah," Daniel greeted, reaching for the thermos at the self-serve station. She hesitated before responding, her voice barely above a whisper. "Morning, Sheriff." It wasn't much, but it was enough to confirm what he'd already sensed. Something was wrong. Walter emerged from the back, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag. "Daniel," he said with a nod. "Haven't seen you much lately." "Been busy," Daniel replied, watching Leah from the corner of his eye. She wouldn't look at him directly, her fingers tightening around the paper in her hands. Walter leaned against the counter, offering a forced smile. "Things all right on your end?" Daniel considered the question before answering. "Been hearing some concerns around town. People going missing." Walter's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in his eyes. Something almost imperceptible. "You know how it is. Folks come and go. Not much to be done about it." Leah flinched at her father's words. It was subtle, but Daniel caught it. He pulled out a $5 bill and placed it on the counter, taking his coffee and a protein bar. "See you around, Leah," he said, his voice gentle but pointed. For the first time, she met his gaze. Just for a second, there was something there, fear, maybe, desperation, whatever it was. It chilled him in a way no crime scene ever had. As he turned to leave, she took a quick step forward, the paper in her hands now clenched in a tight fist. "Sheriff," she started, then stopped, glancing at Walter. Daniel paused, waiting. Leah swallowed hard, then extended the crumpled receipt. "You forgot this." He frowned. He hadn't even asked for a receipt. But the way she pushed it toward him, the way her fingers trembled slightly, it was a message. Daniel took it, nodding once before stepping outside. The sun had fully risen now, bathing the landscape in golden light. But the weight in his chest only grew heavier. Sliding into his truck, he sipped his coffee, then unfolded the receipt. 3 letters, hastily scribbled in pen, stared back at him. Help. A cold knot formed in his stomach. For a long moment, he just sat there, the distant hum of the highway filling the silence. The receipt lay open in his palm, the ink slightly smudged, as if written in a hurry. He exhaled, long and slow, staring back at the gas station. Leah was inside, trapped in whatever situation had made her desperate enough to send this message. And now, he had to figure out what the hell was going on before it was too late. Daniel sat motionless in his truck, the crumpled receipt still clutched in his fingers. The words scribbled across it, "Help," stared back at him. A desperate plea confined to a flimsy slip of paper. His gut twisted, years of experience telling him that this wasn't just some prank or misunderstanding. Leah had handed him that receipt for a reason. She was in trouble. He glanced back at the gas station. Through the front windows, he could see Leah behind the counter, her back rigid, her hands moving mechanically as she rang up a customer. Walter stood nearby, speaking to someone out of view, his face unreadable from this distance. The normalcy of the scene didn't sit right. If Leah was in danger, she couldn't afford to show it. Daniel exhaled, forcing himself to think. He couldn't storm in there demanding answers, not yet. He needed a reason, a cover, something that wouldn't tip off Walter. He reached for his coffee, taking a slow sip as he considered his options. Then, in one smooth motion, he started the truck and pulled out of the lot, driving away as if nothing had happened. But he wasn't going far. Just down the road, he pulled into an empty lot, positioning his truck where he still had a partial view of the station. He turned off the engine and waited, eyes trained on the entrance. If something was wrong, Walter might make a move soon. Minutes passed. Leah kept working, but there was a stiffness to her movements. Walter walked behind the counter, disappearing into the back room. Customers came and went. Everything appeared normal, until it didn't. Without warning, Walter emerged from the back, grabbed Leah by the arm, and pulled her toward the rear exit. Her resistance was subtle, a hesitation, a glance over her shoulder, but enough for Daniel to notice. A moment later, they were gone. Daniel didn't wait. He threw the truck into gear and sped back toward the station. When he pulled in, something was immediately off. The red rock stop sign swayed in the breeze, its rusty chains creaking, but inside, the place was dark. The open sign had been switched off. That made no sense. He stepped out, boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the door. Through the glass, he could see the dim interior, no movement. No Leah, no Walter. He tried the handle, locked. His pulse quickened. He knocked, hard. "Walter? Leah?" Silence. He circled around to the side of the building, checking the small parking lot. Walter's truck was gone, but something else caught his eye, a disturbance near the rear exit. The door wasn't fully closed, left slightly ajar as if someone had been in a hurry. Nearby, an old metal chair lay overturned, one leg bent where it had hit the pavement. Daniel stepped closer, scanning the ground. A faint scuff mark streaked across the concrete, as if someone had been dragged. That was enough. His instincts screamed at him now. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't good. He yanked out his phone and dialed the station. "This is Hayes," he said the moment dispatch picked up. "I need a patrol unit at Red Rock Stop immediately. Possible abduction." "Copy that, Sheriff." The dispatcher responded. "Do you need backup?" Just send someone fast, he said, already heading toward his truck. He needed information. And fast. A few blocks away, Rosa's diner sat tucked between a pawn shop and an old hardware store. It had been a staple in Gallup for decades. A place where people lingered over coffee and small talk. If anyone had seen something unusual at the gas station, it would be someone in there. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside. The scent of bacon and fresh coffee hung in the air, but the usual hum of conversation quieted slightly when people noticed him. Small towns worked that way. When the sheriff walked in with a look like his, people took notice. Rosa Martinez was behind the counter, wiping down a mug. She was in her 60s, tough as nails, and had been serving up the best breakfast burritos in Gallup since before Daniel was born. "Sheriff," she greeted, her sharp eyes immediately narrowing. "You look like you've got something on your mind." Daniel leaned against the counter. "I'm looking for Leah Briggs. Have you seen her today?" Rosa paused just long enough to confirm she knew something. "She was working when I got gas this morning," she said, keeping her voice casual. "Something happened?" "She's gone," Daniel said plainly. "Walter too." That got her attention. Her grip on the mug tightened. "Gone?" Daniel nodded. "The station's locked up. Looks like they left in a hurry." Rosa let out a breath, setting the mug down. "I knew something was off," she muttered. "Leah's been..." She hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "She's been jumpy lately." Kept looking over her shoulder, like she was expecting trouble. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Did she say anything to you?" "Not much, but a few nights ago. She asked me if I ever thought about leaving Gallup. Just packing up and going somewhere new." Rosa shook her head. "That girl's never said a word about wanting to leave before." That settled it. Leah hadn't disappeared by choice. Daniel straightened. "You see anyone hanging around the station lately? Strangers?" Rosa wiped her hands on a dish rag, thinking. "Yeah, couple of guys. White truck, tinted windows. Not locals. They stopped by twice last week. Didn't buy much, just watched." That was enough to send his gut into overdrive. Leah was scared. Strangers had been watching her. And now she was gone. He nodded once. "Thanks, Rosa." Without another word, he strode out, his mind already racing through the next steps. He needed more than gut instincts. He needed proof. Back at the gas station, the surveillance camera above the entrance was still intact. If it had been recording, it might show exactly what happened. He pulled out his multi-tool and popped open the case, removing the memory card. Sliding into his truck, he inserted it into a small reader connected to his laptop. The footage loaded, grainy but clear enough. He fast-forwarded, watching the morning unfold in black and white. Customers came and went. Leah worked behind the counter. Walter moved in and out of the frame. Then, at 10:27 a.m., a white pickup truck pulled into the lot. Two men stepped out, one tall, wearing a ball cap, the other stockier, his face obscured by sunglasses. They walked inside. Moments later, Walter emerged, speaking to them. Leah stiffened behind the counter. The timestamp moved forward. The conversation continued. And then, Walter grabbed Leah by the arm. She struggled, but he forced her toward the back. Seconds later, she was shoved into the truck's cab. Daniel paused the video, his stomach clenched. The driver turned toward the camera for just a second, his face fully visible. Walter Briggs. Daniel leaned back in his seat, the weight of what he was seeing pressing into him. Walter had taken Leah. The question now was why. Daniel clenched the steering wheel, his mind racing. The image of Leah being shoved into Walter's truck played over and over in his head, each repetition tightening the knot in his stomach. He had seen abductions before. He had worked missing persons cases back in Albuquerque, but this was different. This was someone he knew, someone who had reached out to him for help. And now, she was gone. The first thing he did was call the station. The dispatcher, a young officer named Reed, picked up on the second ring. "This is Hayes. I need an official report filed. Possible abduction. Victim: Leah Briggs. Last seen at Red Rock Stop." There was a pause. Then Reed's voice crackled through. "Sheriff, you're saying Walter Briggs kidnapped his own daughter?" "That's exactly what I'm saying." Another pause. This time longer. I don't know if Chief Mathers is gonna sign off on that." Daniel's patience was wearing thin. I'm not asking for permission. Just put the damn report in the system. Reed sighed. All right, but you know how it is. Mathers doesn't like to get involved in family business. That was an understatement. Chief Mathers had been coasting toward retirement for years now, avoiding trouble whenever possible. If a case wasn't a clear-cut crime, if it didn't have blood or bodies, he preferred to let it sit. Daniel parked in front of the station, pushed open the door, and strode inside. The air was stale, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. He spotted Mathers in his office, nursing what looked like his third cup of coffee. I need to put out a bolo on Walter Briggs, Daniel said, stepping inside without preamble. Mathers leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. For what? Kidnapping, Daniel replied flatly. I have security footage of him forcing Leah into his truck. Mathers sighed, setting his cup down. Daniel, let's not rush to conclusions here. Walter's her father. Maybe she went willingly. Daniel ground his teeth. She left me a note asking for help. That doesn't mean he forced her. Daniel exhaled sharply, hands on his hips. You're not taking this seriously. Mathers held up a hand. It's not about that. It's about resources. We don't have the manpower to chase down every missing girl who might have decided to leave town. Daniel's blood boiled. This isn't every missing girl. This is Leah, and I guarantee she didn't leave by choice. Mathers sighed again, looking at Daniel like he was a stubborn child. All right, I'll approve the report, but I can't justify an all-hands search unless we get more evidence. If she's still missing in 48 hours, we'll escalate. 48 hours. A lifetime in a case like this. Daniel clenched his jaw but knew arguing further was pointless. Fine, he muttered, turning on his heel. If the station wasn't going to help, he'd handle this himself. He drove back to Red Rock Stop, pulling into the now empty lot. The sun was sinking lower, stretching shadows across the cracked pavement. He stepped out, scanning the ground where Walter's truck had been parked. The area was still disturbed. Dust kicked up from the hurried departure. But something else caught his eye. A second set of tire tracks. These weren't from Walter's truck. The tread was different, narrower, with deeper grooves. Someone else had been here. Someone who had either arrived before Walter left or followed him out. Daniel crouched down, running a hand over the dry dirt. The tracks led toward the road, blending with the others heading out of town. A sinking feeling settled in his chest. Walter wasn't acting alone. Back in his truck, he pulled up the town's traffic camera system on his laptop. Most of the cameras in Gallup were old, but a few near the highway still worked. He sifted through footage from the last few hours, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. Then he saw it. A black pickup truck, following Walter's vehicle as it left town. Daniel's pulse quickened. This wasn't just some domestic dispute. Leah wasn't just a runaway. Someone had been watching. He needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them. Rosa Martinez was finishing up the dinner rush when Daniel stepped into the diner. She didn't look surprised to see him. I had a feeling you'd be back, she said, crossing her arms. Daniel slid onto a stool. Tell me about Walter. Did he have any trouble with someone recently? Rosa nodded slowly. Yeah, few nights ago. Some guy came in here looking for him. They had words, nothing loud. But it was tense. I didn't hear much, but when Walter left, he looked real upset. Did you get a look at the guy? Tall, pale, wore a ball cap real low. Didn't order anything, just sat at the counter like he was waiting for something. Daniel's mind raced. And Leah? Rosa hesitated. Couple weeks back, she asked me something strange. Wanted to know if I ever thought about leaving Gallup for good. Said she'd been thinking about it. Daniel frowned. Leah never mentioned wanting to leave before. Exactly, Rosa said. Whatever's going on, she knew something bad was coming. That settled it. Walter had gotten mixed up with the wrong people. And now Leah was caught in the middle. Daniel stood. One more thing. Do you know anywhere Walter used to go outside of town? Rosa's expression darkened. Yeah, there's an old mining site a few miles out. Walter used to go there when he needed to clear his head. Daniel didn't waste any time. As the last light of the day faded, he drove out toward the abandoned mine. The road was rough, the landscape turning rugged and desolate. When he reached the site, it was eerily quiet. Rusted machinery lay scattered across the rocky terrain. Remnants of a time when the mine still had life. Daniel stepped out, scanning the ground. The dirt was disturbed near an old storage shed. Tire tracks leading right up to it. He approached cautiously, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and rust. The place was empty, no sign of Walter or Leah. But something on the ground caught his eye. A piece of fabric. He knelt down, picking it up, a handkerchief, embroidered with initials. L.B. Leah had been here, but where was she now? The air inside the abandoned cabin was thick with dust, the wooden floor creaking under Daniel's weight as he took another careful step. The dim light from his flashlight flickered over old crates and rusted tools. Remnants of a place long forgotten. But Leah had been here, he was sure of it. The handkerchief in his pocket, embroidered with her initials, was proof enough. His eyes swept the room, searching for anything else, anything that might tell him where she had been taken. Then, tucked beneath a pile of old newspapers on the rickety wooden table, he saw it, a scrap of paper, yellowed with age, with something hastily scrawled across it in smudged ink. Deliver before midnight, same location. Daniel's stomach tightened. This wasn't a random act. Leah wasn't just missing, she was cargo. His mind raced as he turned the note over in his hands. Walter wasn't working alone. The man might have been desperate. But this wasn't just some father dragging his daughter out of town. This was bigger. And now, Walter had put Leah in the middle of something far worse than he could have imagined. Daniel exhaled, forcing himself to think. Same location. That meant whoever wrote this note assumed Walter already knew where to go. And if Walter had used this cabin before, that meant there was a pattern, something Daniel could trace. Back in his truck, he pulled up the sheriff's department database on his laptop. He searched for Walter Briggs, anything that might connect him to a larger operation. Nothing came up, but when he widened his search to properties near old industrial sites, one name kept appearing: Hollow Sun Industries. Daniel frowned. He had heard of them before, barely. A private company that had once operated mining and energy projects across the Southwest, including in New Mexico. On the surface, it looked like any other corporate failure. Hollow Sun shut down abruptly 10 years ago, with reports of financial collapse. But Daniel had spent enough years in law enforcement to know when a story didn't add up. Digging deeper, he found scattered reports, whispers of illegal activity, missing workers, money laundering accusations, but nothing ever stuck. The company had gone dark before anyone could hold them accountable. And now, years later, their name was popping up again, connected to a missing girl. Daniel didn't believe in coincidences. There was only one person in Gallup who might know more about Hollow Sun. Hector Cruz had been a detective once, and a damn good one. He had worked organized crime cases in Albuquerque before suddenly quitting the force 5 years ago. Daniel had never pressed for details. But now, he needed answers. Finding Hector wasn't hard. The man spent most evenings at a rundown bar on the outskirts of town, drinking just enough to forget whatever demons haunted him. Daniel spotted him at a back booth, nursing a whiskey, his dark eyes flicking up as he approached. "You still don't take a hint, do you?" Hector muttered, not bothering to look at him directly. Daniel slid into the seat across from him. "I need information," Hector scoffed. "And I need another drink." He took a slow sip. "Guess we're both out of luck." Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Hollow Sun." Hector went still. It was only for a second. But Daniel caught it, the tightening of his grip around the glass. The way his jaw tensed ever so slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about," Hector said finally. "That's a lie," Daniel countered. "I found a note, a delivery order. Hollow Sun didn't die 10 years ago. Did it?" Hector let out a bitter chuckle. "You really want to dig into this?" He shook his head. "Walk away, Hayes. Whatever you think you're onto, it's worse." Daniel didn't move. "They took a girl, Leah Briggs." At that, Hector's expression darkened. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. "Damn it, so you do know something." Hector hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "I tried to take them down once. Years ago. Got too close. People started disappearing. Evidence got buried. Next thing I knew, my career was over." He let out a dry laugh. "Guess I got off easy." Daniel studied him. If they're still operating, where do they take their victims? Hector sighed. Depends on what they want with them. He glanced around the bar, then lowered his voice. If it's what I think it is. Leah's being moved. Fast. Most of the girls they take get sent across the border, Mexico. Central America. Once they're gone, they're ghosts. Daniel's stomach turned. Where? There's a warehouse near El Paso. Used to be a Hollow Sun shipping facility before they shut down. Now, it's a stopover. Daniel nodded, already forming a plan. He had to move now. If Leah made it across the border, she was as good as lost. As he stood to leave, Hector grabbed his arm. There's something else, he muttered. Walter Briggs, if he was working with them. It wasn't by choice. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Hector met his gaze. Walter owed someone a big debt. This? Selling Leah? This was him paying it off. Daniel's jaw tightened. Walter wasn't just a desperate father, he was a pawn in something much bigger. Leaving the bar, Daniel headed straight for the station, knowing full well he wasn't going to get the backup he needed. But he had to try. Chief Mathers was sitting at his desk when Daniel stormed in. I need a team, Daniel said without preamble. I know where they're taking Leah. Mathers barely looked up from his paperwork. And I'm sure you have a warrant and solid evidence? Daniel slammed the note onto the desk. This is all I have. You give me a couple of guys. We can stop this before she's gone. Mathers shook his head. Not enough. Daniel clenched his fists. You don't get it. If we don't move now, she's going to disappear. Mathers sighed. And if you go in half-cocked without the law behind you, you'll blow any chance we have at bringing these people down for good. Daniel gritted his teeth. He understood Mathers' logic, but Leah didn't have time. Without another word, he turned and left. His phone rang as he reached his truck. Unknown number. He answered. Hayes. The voice on the other end was shaky. Panicked. Sheriff, I screwed up. Daniel's grip tightened. Walter? I didn't have a choice. Walter rasped. I needed the money. But I thought I could fix it. Where's Leah? Daniel demanded. Walter sucked in a breath. I don't know. They took her. I was supposed to hand her over. But they. A gunshot rang out through the speaker. Then, silence. Daniel froze. Walter? Nothing. The line was dead. He stared at his phone, pulse hammering in his ears. Walter was gone, and whoever had just silenced him was still out there. The road stretched into darkness, the headlights of Daniel's truck slicing through the thick, empty night. He pushed the accelerator, the engine growling as the truck ate up the miles. The last thing he had heard from Walter was a desperate, broken plea, then a gunshot. And now, Daniel was racing toward a crime scene, not knowing if he was about to find another dead body or the last trace of Leah before she disappeared for good. The GPS led him off the main highway, guiding him onto a cracked, narrow road that ran alongside an old mining site. The land here was barren, dotted with rusting machinery and dry brush. No houses, no streetlights, just silence, save for the occasional howl of the wind. Then he saw it. Walter's truck sat motionless on the side of the road, its driver's side door wide open, the interior shrouded in darkness. Daniel slowed as he pulled up behind it, his instincts already screaming that something was wrong. He left his headlights on, flooding the scene with pale yellow light, and stepped out with one hand hovering near his holster. The first thing he noticed was the blood. It painted the gravel beneath the driver's seat, still fresh enough to glisten under the lights. Walter slumped forward over the steering wheel, unmoving. A dark hole punched into the side of his head. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air, mixing with the sharp metallic scent of blood. Execution style. Daniel clenched his jaw, scanning the ground for any signs of Leah. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, except for something on the passenger seat. He stepped closer, his pulse pounding. A frayed rope, one end cleanly severed. She had been tied up, but at some point, either before or after Walter was shot, she had been cut loose. Daniel's mind raced. If Leah had managed to escape, she could be anywhere out here, alone in the darkness. Or worse, someone had taken her from this truck and left Walter behind as a message. He reached inside and grabbed Walter's phone from the dashboard. The screen was cracked, the last call still displayed. His number. Walter had been calling for help. and no one had gotten there in time. Daniel exhaled sharply, then noticed something wedged between the seats. A photograph, edges curled from time. He pulled it free and frowned. It was an old picture, years old, of a group of men standing together outside what looked like a factory. They all looked rough, dressed in worn work clothes. Some of them grinning like they shared a dangerous secret. His breath caught as he focused on one face. Hector Cruz. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Hector had told him he had walked away from Hollow Sun, that he had tried to take them down. But this photo told a different story. He hadn't just known about them. He had been part of them. Daniel pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the scene before stepping back into his truck. He had a feeling Hector had been lying to him, and it was time to find out why. The drive back to town felt longer, the weight of what he had just seen settling in his chest like a stone. He didn't bother calling Hector ahead of time. If the man had answers, Daniel would get them face to face. The lights were on in Hector's small house when Daniel pulled up. He pounded on the door, harder than necessary. After a long pause, it creaked open. Hector stood there, eyes shadowed, a drink in his hand. "Sheriff," he said, voice flat, "didn't expect you back so soon." Daniel held up the photo. "You want to tell me why your face is in this?" Hector didn't even blink. He took a slow sip of his drink before answering. "I figured you'd find that eventually." Daniel's patience was razor thin. "Start talking." Hector sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I worked security for Hollow Sun a long time ago, before I knew what they really were." "Bullshit," Daniel snapped. "This wasn't some minimum wage security job. These men were running something illegal. You were part of it." Hector's jaw tightened. "Yeah, I was. For a while. But I got out." Daniel stared him down. "Not soon enough." Hector set his glass down hard on the counter. "What do you want from me?" "Hayes? I want to know where they took Leah." Daniel shot back. Hector didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past Daniel, toward something outside the window. His face darkened. Daniel turned, following his gaze. A black pickup truck sat parked at the end of the block, just barely visible under the glow of a street lamp. Same truck he had seen in the traffic cam footage. Same truck that had followed Walter. He had been followed. A low tension settled in the air. Hector exhaled sharply. "You need to go." Daniel ignored him. "They watching you, or me?" Hector's fingers twitched. "Doesn't matter." Daniel's grip tightened around his belt. "It does if they're planning on tying up loose ends." Hector didn't argue. He just stepped back and shut the door without another word. Daniel walked back to his truck, his skin crawling with the awareness of unseen eyes. He could feel the weight of their gaze as he slid into the driver's seat. But he didn't start the engine. Instead, he waited. The black pickup didn't move. Not at first. Then, after what felt like an eternity, its headlights flickered on, and it started driving toward him. Daniel kept his grip firm on the steering wheel, his gaze flicking to the rearview mirror. The black pickup truck followed at a steady pace, its headlights distant but unwavering. Whoever was inside wasn't just another late-night driver. They were watching him, tracking his every move. He inhaled slowly, forcing his mind to stay sharp. He had spent years reading people, understanding when someone was just passing through and when someone meant trouble. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. Instead of heading straight back to his house, Daniel took a sharp turn onto a side road, a narrow strip of asphalt that cut through the open desert. No streetlights, no traffic, just darkness stretching in every direction. He kept his speed steady, pretending he wasn't aware of his unwanted company. The truck behind him followed. Daniel took another turn, this time onto a dirt road leading to an old service route once used by miners. His tires kicked up dust, the road barely wide enough for two vehicles. Then, without warning, he killed his headlights and pressed the brakes, bringing his truck to a near-silent stop. He reached for his gun, heart pounding steadily in his chest. The black pickup hesitated, its headlights slowed, flickering through the dust cloud. Then, after a brief pause, it pulled up ahead, stopping a few yards away. Two figures stepped out. They moved with purpose, their boots crunching against the gravel. The dim moonlight cast long shadows over them, highlighting the identical black jackets they wore, each bearing a distinct emblem stitched onto the back. A cracked sun, its rays jagged and broken. Daniel had seen enough symbols in his career to know this wasn't just a coincidence. Hollow Sun Industries. One of the men, taller than the other, stepped forward, his hands casually resting on his belt. "You've been busy, Sheriff." Daniel remained still, his grip tightening around the gun at his side. "Something I can help you with?" The man let out a slow chuckle. "Depends. You've been poking around in things that don't concern you." Daniel's eyes stayed locked on them. "A missing girl concerns me." The second man, stockier and with a scar cutting across his cheek, took a step closer. "Then let me give you some advice. Drop it." His voice was cold, void of any real emotion. "This isn't a fight you want." Daniel exhaled, his patience wearing thin. "You already killed Walter Briggs. What's next? You going to kill me too?" The taller man smirked. "Only if you make it necessary." Silence stretched between them, thick and unyielding. The wind howled softly, carrying with it the distant rustling of dry brush. Daniel's mind worked fast, assessing his options. Then, in a blink, everything changed. The stocky man reached for his gun. Daniel moved faster. He dropped low as the first shot rang out, the bullet slicing through the air where his head had been a second ago. In one swift motion, he pulled his own gun and fired. The taller man staggered back, a sharp cry of pain escaping him as he clutched his shoulder. The stocky man lunged behind the pickup for cover. Cursing under his breath, Daniel pressed against his truck. Taking a deep breath, he only had a few seconds before they regrouped. A second shot cracked through the night, whizzing past Daniel's ear. He didn't hesitate. He turned, aimed, and fired twice. The stocky man let out a choked gasp before crumpling onto the ground. The taller man, still gripping his wounded shoulder, stumbled backward. For a moment, his eyes met Daniel's, filled with something twisted, almost smug. Then he turned and ran into the desert, disappearing into the shadows. Daniel kept his gun raised, breath heavy. He could chase after him, but he had no idea what lay beyond the darkness. And there was something else, something more important. He turned his attention back to the man he had shot. Blood seeped into the dirt beneath him, his breaths shallow. Daniel knelt beside him, pressing a firm hand against his wound. "Where is she?" The man let out a low, pained chuckle. "Leah?" He coughed, spitting blood. "She won't be Leah much longer." Daniel's stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" The man's gaze flickered, his energy fading fast, but his lips curled into a weak smirk. "You're already too late." Then, just like that, his body went slack. Daniel clenched his jaw, shoving down the frustration burning inside him. He searched the man's pockets, fingers brushing against something smooth. Pulling it out, he found a photograph, a grainy image of Leah, bound and gagged, her eyes wide with fear. On the back, an address was scrawled in messy handwriting. Route 167. Abandoned medical facility, 30 miles east. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. A hospital. Hollow Sun Industries wasn't just trafficking Leah, they were doing something to her. He had no idea what was waiting for him at that address. But one thing was clear. He was running out of time. Daniel gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he navigated the desolate highway. The night stretched endlessly around him, the road ahead barely illuminated by the dim glow of his headlights. The address scrawled on the back of the photo burned in his mind. Route 167. An abandoned medical facility. He had spent enough time in law enforcement to know that places like this never truly stayed abandoned. If Hollow Sun still had use for it, then Leah was in more danger than he had imagined. The desert wind howled outside, kicking up loose dust across the cracked pavement. His GPS showed he was only a few miles away. But there was no sign of civilization, just endless stretches of barren land. The occasional skeletal remains of long-dead trees dotting the roadside. Then, in the distance, the silhouette of a large, crumbling structure emerged from the darkness. It sat alone in the vast emptiness, its once white walls now stained with time and neglect. The windows were either shattered or boarded up, and the rusted remnants of a collapsed sign lay in the dirt near the entrance. But one thing stood out. There was light inside. Daniel killed his headlights and coasted the last 100 yards, parking behind a cluster of dead bushes. He grabbed his gun, checked his magazine, and stepped out into the cool night air. He approached cautiously, his boots silent on the dusty ground. The front entrance was chained shut, a heavy padlock securing it. But he had no intention of going in that way. He circled around the side, moving toward a broken window where faint light flickered from within. As he got closer, voices carried through the dry air. "Is everything ready?" one voice asked, muffled but clear enough for Daniel to make out. A second voice responded, lower and laced with something unsettling. "Almost. The girl is being prepped." Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. Leah was here. He crouched beneath the window, peering inside. The room was filled with medical equipment, surgical trays, IV stands, metal gurneys covered in thin sheets. Against the far wall, a set of old filing cabinets stood partially open, stacks of folders spilling onto the floor. The place looked like it had been left to rot years ago. But the equipment told a different story. Someone was still using it. He needed more information before charging in blind. Moving carefully, he found an unlocked side door and slipped inside. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic. But underneath it was something else, something metallic. Blood. His grip tightened around his gun as he moved down the dimly lit hallway, past peeling walls and rusted medical carts. The voices were clearer now, echoing from a room at the end of the hall. He pressed himself against the wall, listening. The others didn't last long. One man said, his voice carrying an unsettling casualness, "Let's hope this one is different." A second voice chuckled darkly. "She has good genetics. Strong. If she survives the process, she could be useful." Daniel's stomach turned. This wasn't just human trafficking. This was something worse. He needed to find Leah, now. He stepped away from the wall, intending to move toward the source of the voices. But something caught his eye. A door slightly ajar, a dim desk lamp casting flickering light inside. He hesitated, then slipped into the room. It was an office, or at least it used to be. The walls were lined with rusting metal shelves, each one filled with folders, patient files, and stacks of old reports. He grabbed the nearest folder and flipped it open. Case #048. Subject: female, 19. Status: experiment failed. Subject deceased. He grabbed another. Case #051. Subject: female, 21. Status: experiment unsuccessful. Subject transferred. His breath caught as he flipped through page after page, all detailing women who had disappeared from small towns just like Gallup. Some were marked as deceased, others simply labeled as missing. Then he saw Leah's name. Case #057. Subject: Leah Briggs. Status: pending, preparation phase. Preparation phase. Daniel slammed the folder shut, forcing down the sickening feeling in his gut. He didn't know what these people were doing to the girls they took. But he didn't need to read any further to know he had no time left. A noise outside the office made him freeze. Footsteps. He backed up, pressing himself into the shadows as two men passed by the open door. He caught a glimpse of their uniforms, dark tactical gear, the hollow sun emblems stitched onto their sleeves. These weren't just low-level criminals. They were trained. Once the hallway was clear, Daniel slipped out, moving quickly. The voices from earlier were still talking somewhere deeper inside, but he focused on the hallways branching off to the left, patient rooms. He checked each one as he passed. Most were empty, their beds rusted and covered in dust. But as he neared the last door, something inside moved. Daniel raised his gun and stepped inside. Leah lay strapped to a metal gurney, her wrists and ankles bound. She was conscious, barely, her head lolling to the side as she fought to stay awake. A thin IV line ran from her arm to a half-empty bag of clear liquid. Something Daniel didn't recognize. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then widening as she saw him. "Sheriff." Her voice was weak, hoarse. Daniel moved quickly, unfastening the restraints. "I'm getting you out of here." She flinched as he pulled the IV from her arm, her body trembling. Whatever they had given her, it had taken its toll. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, but when she tried to move, her legs buckled. He caught her before she could fall. Footsteps echoed down the hall. They were out of time. Daniel pulled Leah's arm over his shoulder and moved, his grip firm as he led her toward the exit. They needed to get out before those men realized what had happened. But as he reached the hallway, something cold pressed against the back of his skull. A gun. Going somewhere. Sheriff? Daniel's muscles tensed. They had been caught. Daniel barely breathed as the cold steel of the gun barrel pressed against his skull. His mind worked fast, assessing the situation. He still had his own weapon. But with Leah barely able to stand, making a move now could cost them both their lives. A low chuckle came from behind him. Thought you'd just walk out, Sheriff? The voice was smooth, almost amused. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Daniel exhaled slowly, keeping his grip tight around Leah's waist as she swayed against him. He could feel her shivering, her body weak from whatever they had given her. I don't know who you think I am, Daniel said evenly, but you should know I don't go down easy. The man behind him let out a slow sigh. That's the problem, Hayes. You don't know when to quit. In that moment, Daniel made his move. He twisted sharply, knocking the gun aside with his elbow just as the man pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, deafening in the narrow hallway. The bullet grazed Daniel's shoulder, a sharp burn tearing through his flesh. But he didn't stop. He drove his fist into the attacker's jaw, sending him staggering backward. Leah gasped as Daniel shoved her behind him, raising his own gun. The man, one of Hollow Sun's operatives, spat blood onto the floor, glaring at him with a mixture of rage and something close to admiration. You're making a mistake, he hissed, wiping his mouth. Daniel didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The man collapsed before he could reach for his weapon again. The echo of the gunshot faded, replaced by the distant sound of running footsteps. Reinforcements. Daniel grabbed Leah's arm. We need to move. She barely nodded, her breath shallow. Whatever they had given her, it was wearing her down fast. He guided her forward, moving as quickly as he could through the dimly lit corridor. A red warning light pulsed from somewhere deeper in the facility, flashing in eerie intervals, casting long shadows along the walls. The entire building felt alive, humming with a low mechanical whine, as if it were waking from a long sleep. Then, Daniel heard it, a voice, low, calm, clinical. Administer the next dose. She needs to be prepped for transport. Daniel froze. He turned toward the sound, his pulse hammering. The door to a small operating room was slightly ajar, the light inside casting an unnatural glow onto the floor. He could see a man in a white lab coat, his back turned, standing over another patient. Not Leah, someone else. Daniel clenched his jaw and nudged the door open just enough to see. A young woman, no older than Leah, was strapped to a surgical table, her wrists and ankles bound with thick leather straps. She was motionless, her eyes half open, her chest rising and falling in slow, uneven breaths. A thin IV line ran from her arm to a half-empty bag of clear liquid. The doctor picked up a syringe filled with something dark. Daniel stepped inside, gun raised, put it down. The man didn't even flinch. He simply smiled. "Ah," the doctor murmured, his voice eerily calm. "You must be the sheriff. I've heard a lot about you." Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger. "I won't ask again." The doctor finally turned to face him. His name tag read, Dr. Elias Carter. "I assume you've figured it out by now," Carter said casually, still holding the syringe. "What we do here?" Daniel didn't respond. Carter chuckled. "You law enforcement types always assume the worst. Trafficking, murder. But this," he gestured around the room. "This is something greater, something necessary." Daniel stepped closer, his gun unwavering. "Where's Leah?" Carter sighed, as if Daniel had just asked an exhausting question. "She's close," he said, "but if you're hoping to take her back, I should warn you, you won't be bringing her back as the girl you remember." Daniel's stomach turned. What the hell does that mean? Carter smiled again. Then, without warning, he pressed the syringe into the girl's IV line and injected the entire dose. The girl convulsed violently. Daniel fired. The shot caught Carter in the shoulder, sending him sprawling backward against the medical tray, knocking instruments to the floor. Daniel rushed forward, his hands shaking as he yanked the IV line from the girl's arm. But it was too late. Her body twitched once, then fell still. Carter laughed, even as he bled. "You're too late," he gasped. You don't even know what you're fighting against. Daniel grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. Where's Leah? Carter coughed, his breath ragged. They're preparing her for the next phase. Daniel's stomach dropped. Then the alarm blared. A real alarm this time, piercing. Urgent. Someone knew he was here. He let Carter slump to the ground, unconscious from the blood loss. He didn't have time to waste. He bolted into the hallway, finding Leah where he had left her. She was barely conscious, her skin pale. Daniel, she mumbled. I got you, he said, pulling her arm over his shoulder. A door burst open down the hall. 3 men in black gear stormed into the corridor, their rifles raised. Daniel fired first. 1 man went down instantly, a bullet tearing through his chest. The other 2 scattered, one ducking behind a metal cart, the other firing wildly in Daniel's direction. Daniel pulled Leah with him, using the corner of the hallway for cover. He returned fire, forcing them to retreat slightly. Come on, he muttered, guiding Leah forward. They reached an exit door, but it was chained shut from the outside. Footsteps pounded behind them. Daniel made a split-second decision. He raised his gun and fired at the emergency lock. The door burst open. Cold air rushed in as Daniel dragged Leah outside, his body running on pure adrenaline. They weren't safe yet, but they were out. The sound of shouting and gunfire echoed behind them. But Daniel didn't stop. He carried Leah toward the truck he had hidden earlier, shoving open the door and getting her inside. As he started the engine, Leah let out a small, pained breath. She was shaking violently. Daniel's gut twisted. He had saved her from the facility, but he had no idea what they had done to her. The desert road stretched endlessly ahead, a dark ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the vast emptiness. Daniel's truck roared down the highway, dust trailing behind as he pressed the gas pedal harder. In the passenger seat, Leah convulsed violently, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. Leah, stay with me, Daniel shouted over the engine's growl, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Her body trembled, sweat glistening on her forehead despite the cool night air rushing in through the half-shattered window. Her fingers clawed weakly at her chest, as if something inside her was fighting to break free. Daniel reached over briefly, pressing a hand to her shoulder. Just hold on, kid, we're getting out of here. But in the rearview mirror, twin headlights pierced the night. The black SUVs were gaining on them. His stomach clenched. He had seen those vehicles before, Hollow Sun operatives. If they caught him now, neither he nor Leah would make it out alive. A burst of gunfire shattered the side mirror. Son of a... Daniel gritted his teeth, jerking the wheel to the left as the first SUV pulled up alongside him. A masked man leaned out of the passenger side window, rifle raised. Another round of bullets sprayed across the truck's side, tearing through the metal like paper. Daniel swerved hard, ramming his truck against the SUV. The impact sent the other vehicle skidding toward the shoulder, kicking up a cloud of dust. But the second SUV was already closing in, its high beams glaring through the rear windshield. Leah let out a strangled gasp, her back arching against the seat. Her pupils were blown wide, her breathing erratic. Damn it, kid, hold on, Daniel muttered, his pulse hammering. He had to lose them. Fast. Up ahead, the road curved sharply, descending toward a dry wash. He had one shot at this. He slammed the brakes, yanking the wheel hard. The truck veered onto the shoulder, skidding into the turn. The SUV behind him didn't react fast enough. It barreled forward, missing the curve entirely and launching off the road, flipping violently before landing in a crumpled heap. One down, but the second SUV was still on him. Another spray of bullets shattered the rear windshield, glass raining down on Leah's already trembling form. Daniel knew he couldn't keep this up. His truck was already running on borrowed time, riddled with bullet holes and bleeding oil. Then, the inevitable happened. A shot rang out, and his front tire exploded. The truck lurched sideways, spinning uncontrollably as metal screeched against asphalt. Leah's limp body jerked violently as the truck veered off the road. Then, everything flipped. The world turned upside down in a blur of headlights and dust. The impact slammed through Daniel's bones as the truck rolled once, twice, before finally coming to a jarring halt in a dry ravine. For a moment, Everything was silent. Daniel blinked, his head pounding. His shoulder throbbed where the seatbelt had cut into him. Dust filled his lungs, the sharp tang of gasoline lingering in the air. Then, a groan. Leah. She lay motionless beside him, her chest barely rising and falling. Daniel ignored the pain shooting through his ribs and reached for her. Leah? Leah, can you hear me? Her eyelids fluttered, but no words came out. Above them, footsteps crunched against gravel. Daniel looked up. The remaining Hollow Sun operatives were already approaching, rifles in hand. He tried reaching for his gun, but the crash had knocked it somewhere in the wreckage. His fingers closed around nothing but dirt. One of the masked men stepped closer, his weapon aimed directly at Daniel's chest. This is the end of the road, Sheriff. Daniel clenched his jaw. He had fought too hard to die like this. But before the man could pull the trigger, a sharp gunshot cracked through the night. The Hollow Sun operative jerked backward, a spray of blood erupting from his shoulder as he crumpled to the ground. A second shot followed, hitting the other man square in the chest. Daniel whipped his head around, trying to locate the source. That's when he saw the figure standing on the ridge above them, rifle smoking under the moonlight. Hector Cruz. The former detective strode down the incline, his gun still raised as he scanned the wreckage. Without missing a beat, he stepped over the fallen men, grabbing Daniel by the arm and hauling him upright. Can you walk? Hector asked gruffly. Daniel swayed but nodded. All alive. But Leah. Hector was already moving, leaning into the truck to scoop the girl into his arms. She was barely conscious, her breath uneven. We don't have time, Hector said, glancing toward the distant horizon. More of them will be coming. Daniel hesitated for half a second, his instincts screaming at him not to trust Hector. But he didn't have a choice. Not now. With one last look at the burning wreckage of his truck, Daniel climbed into the passenger seat of Hector's waiting SUV. The engine roared to life, tires spitting dirt as they tore away from the scene, as the lights of Hollow Sun's remaining vehicles flickered in the distance. One question burned in Daniel's mind. Why the hell was Hector Cruz helping them? Daniel sat in the dimly lit cabin, his muscles tense as he listened to the distant howl of the wind through the trees. The wooden walls creaked with age, and dust floated in the slivers of moonlight that filtered through the cracked windows. The cabin was old, abandoned long ago, but right now, it was the safest place they had. Leah lay motionless on a tattered couch, her breathing shallow. The feverish sweat on her forehead had worsened, and every few minutes, her body twitched as if caught in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Hector crouched beside her, placing a damp cloth on her forehead. His face was unreadable, the deep lines of age and regret making him look even older in the dim light. Daniel watched him carefully, his fingers twitching near the gun at his side. Start talking, he said, his voice rough from exhaustion. Why the hell did you help us? Hector sighed, rubbing his temples before finally meeting Daniel's gaze. Because I owe a debt, he muttered. One I've been trying to pay for a long time. Daniel narrowed his eyes. A debt to who? Hector let out a bitter chuckle. To every girl I couldn't save. Silence settled between them, heavy and suffocating. Daniel wasn't a man who trusted easily, and everything about Hector Cruz screamed liar. But he had saved their lives. That had to count for something. Hector leaned back against the old wooden chair, exhaling slowly. I used to work for Hollow Sun. Not as a scientist, not as a soldier, just a fixer. I made problems disappear, cleaned up the messes they didn't want the world to see. Daniel's jaw clenched. He had seen men like Hector before, men who did whatever was necessary to survive, no matter the cost. But I didn't know the full scope of what they were doing. Hector continued. Not at first. The disappearances, the experiments. It was bigger than anything I could have imagined. And when I did figure it out, I ran. He let out a slow breath. I've been running ever since. Daniel folded his arms. And now you expect me to believe you suddenly grew a conscience? Hector's eyes darkened. Believe what you want, Sheriff. But the people who took Leah? They're not just human traffickers. They're worse. Daniel didn't respond, but the tension in his chest tightened. He had already seen enough to know Hollow Sun wasn't just another criminal syndicate. Hector reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, worn at the edges. He tossed it onto the small table between them. You might want to see this. Daniel hesitated before grabbing the folder. He flipped it open, scanning the yellow documents inside. Medical records, research notes, old photographs. His eyes skimmed the lines of text. And with each word, his stomach twisted tighter. Then he saw it. Leah Briggs. Status. Acquired. 2005. His blood ran cold. Beneath her name, the words were written in clinical detachment. Born. Houston, Texas. 2003. Abducted. Houston General Hospital. 2005. Subject number 112, viable specimen. Daniel's grip on the paper tightened. He read the lines again. But they didn't change. Leah wasn't Walter Briggs's daughter. She had been taken. For nearly 2 decades, she had been living under a false identity. Her entire life a lie. Hector watched Daniel's reaction carefully. Now you understand why they want her back. Daniel's throat felt dry. What the hell does viable specimen mean? Hector hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. Leah isn't just another girl they grabbed off the street. She was taken because of what she is. What's inside her? Daniel's hands curled into fists. You're saying they kidnapped her for her DNA? Not just her DNA. Hector corrected. Her entire genetic structure. Daniel exhaled sharply, struggling to wrap his mind around it. What the hell does that even mean? Hector leaned forward, lowering his voice. Hollow Sun has been running genetic trials for decades. They've experimented on hundreds, maybe thousands, of women. But most of them didn't survive the process. His gaze flickered to Leah. She did. Daniel's stomach turned. Survive what? Their enhancements. Hector muttered. Their modifications. Daniel's head pounded. He had dealt with criminals his entire career, murderers, traffickers, drug lords. But this was something else. Hector continued. Whatever they injected her with back at that facility, it wasn't just a sedative. It was the next step in their process. They were preparing her for something. Daniel looked at Leah, her pale face twisted in discomfort. How do we stop it? He asked. Hector sighed. That's the problem. We don't know how far along she is. Whatever Hollow Sun did to her as a child, it was already in her system. This new injection, it might have activated something. Daniel's mind raced, trying to process the implications. Leah stirred slightly, her lips parting as if she were trying to say something. Daniel immediately moved closer. Leah, can you hear me? Her eyelids fluttered, and she let out a small, pained whisper. They're coming. Daniel stiffened. Who's coming? Leah's breathing hitched, her body tensing as if caught in a fever dream. Hector's expression darkened. We need to move, now. Daniel stood, already reaching for his gun. How long do we have? Hector grabbed his rifle. If she's feeling them already? Not long. Outside, in the distance, a low rumbling broke the silence. Engines. Headlights flickered in the distance, weaving through the mountain pass like hungry eyes searching the darkness. Hollow Sun had found them. The fire crackled low in the small cabin, its light flickering against the wooden walls. Daniel sat on the edge of a battered chair, exhaustion weighing heavy on his shoulders. He had barely closed his eyes when Leah let out a sudden, sharp gasp. His head snapped toward her. She was awake. Leah's body tensed against the couch, her breathing uneven, her pupils were unnaturally dilated, the whites of her eyes stark against the dim glow of the room. She blinked rapidly, her gaze darting across the space as if she didn't recognize where she was. Daniel leaned forward cautiously. Leah? Her head jerked toward his voice. But she didn't answer right away. For a moment, her expression was blank, as if she were trying to place him, trying to remember. Then, her lips parted, her voice raw. Where? She swallowed hard, her throat dry. Where am I? Daniel exhaled, tension loosening just slightly. You're safe, he assured her. We got you out. Leah's fingers twitched against the blanket draped over her. She looked down at her arms, as if expecting to see something that wasn't there. It feels wrong. Daniel exchanged a look with Hector, who was standing silently in the corner. The older man stepped forward, arms crossed over his chest. Do you remember anything? Hector asked, his voice calm but firm. Leah squeezed her eyes shut, her face pinched as she tried to force something, anything, to come back. But when she opened them again, there was only frustration. No, it's like, Pieces of a dream I can't put together. Daniel nodded. He had expected this. Whatever Hollow Sun had injected her with had done more than just weaken her, it had tampered with something inside her mind. Hector crouched beside her, watching carefully. Leah, listen to me. We need to know what they did to you. Anything you can remember. Leah suddenly shivered, her breath quickening. I keep seeing flashes, she murmured, almost to herself. A white room, shadows moving around me, a voice. Her brows furrowed as she strained to recall. Then, she froze, her entire body going rigid. Daniel leaned in. What is it? Leah's eyes slowly lifted to his, wide and filled with something darker than fear. They were waiting for me, she whispered. Silence fell over the cabin. Daniel felt a cold knot form in his stomach. What do you mean? Leah shook her head, pressing her palms against her temples as if trying to keep her mind from unraveling. I don't know, she whispered, but whatever they started, it's not over. Hector muttered a curse under his breath. He turned to Daniel. We don't have time to sit around hoping her memory comes back. If we don't figure out what they injected her with, she might not have a memory to return to. Daniel clenched his jaw. He knew Hector was right. Every second wasted was another second Leah was slipping further away from herself. And they were running out of time. Daniel stood near the cabin window, watching the dark treetops sway in the cold night air. He had spent his whole life reacting to crime, chasing after the damage had already been done. This time, he wasn't going to wait. He turned back to Hector. Where's their main facility? Hector rubbed a hand down his face. There's an old industrial plant near the border. It was once used as a manufacturing site, but after Hollow Sun took over, it became their testing ground. Daniel exhaled slowly. That's where they took the others. Hector nodded. And where they were going to take Leah permanently if you hadn't gotten to her first. Daniel's grip on the windowsill tightened. He had seen Hollow Suns reach firsthand. This wasn't a one-man job. He needed reinforcements. Gallup wasn't a big town, but it had its fair share of men who knew how to fight. And right now, Daniel needed allies, not just those willing, but those capable. By dawn, he was standing in a dimly lit back room of Rosa's diner, facing the handful of people he had managed to convince. 4 men stood before him, a mix of ex-cops and military veterans. Ryan Greaves, a former Marine sniper who had retired to Gallup after 2 tours overseas. Eddie Torres, an ex-detective who had walked away from the force after getting too close to corruption. Luis Mendoza, a mechanic and former gang member who knew more about weapons smuggling than he probably should have. And Jack Reynolds, an old deputy from Daniel's time in Albuquerque, a man who still owed him a favor. They all looked at him expectantly. Daniel took a breath and laid it all out. He told them about Hollow Sun, about Leah, about the hundreds of others who had been taken and never seen again. He showed them the documents Hector had stolen, the evidence of systematic disappearances over the last 20 years. And then, he told them the most important part. We have one chance to stop this. Ryan was the first to break the silence. He tapped a scarred knuckle against the table. You tell me where and when, he said simply. The others nodded. It was done. The plan came together quickly. Hector had the blueprints to the facility, a sprawling complex with underground levels that hadn't been in use since the 90s. The main lab was deep inside, guarded, armed, and hidden. They couldn't take a full frontal assault. It had to be precise. Ryan and Eddie would handle sniper coverage from an abandoned watchtower a few hundred yards from the plant. Luis and Jack would take the north entrance, setting charges to blow the power supply. Daniel and Hector would go in through the loading docks, the least guarded entrance but the closest to the labs. And Leah, she wasn't staying behind. I'm coming with you, she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion on her face. Daniel shook his head. No, you're not in any condition. Leah's hands curled into fists. They did this to me, she said fiercely. I need to know why. I need to stop them. Daniel looked at Hector, who simply shrugged. She's right. Daniel exhaled sharply. Damn it. Fine, he said, but you do exactly what I say. No heroics. Leah nodded. Agreed. As night fell, they loaded their weapons, checked their gear, and prepared for the fight ahead. Daniel stood outside the cabin, staring at the vast darkness ahead. Somewhere beyond those hills, Hollow Sun was waiting. But this time, they weren't hunting him. He was coming for them. The night air was heavy with the scent of dust and metal as Daniel crouched behind a cluster of rusted shipping containers. His team silently fanned out around him. From their vantage point, they could see the Hollow Sun facility, a sprawling industrial plant surrounded by barbed wire fences and floodlights. It looked abandoned from the outside, but the movement of armed guards along the perimeter told a different story. This place was alive. Daniel turned to Hector, who was hunched beside him, scanning the area with binoculars. "Still think this is a good idea?" Daniel murmured. Hector exhaled sharply. "No, but it's the only shot we've got." Leah, crouched on Daniel's other side, adjusted the grip on her pistol. Though still weak, she was determined to be part of this fight. She had more at stake than any of them. Luis, their explosives expert, whispered, "Power grids to the south. If we kill the lights, we'll have a few minutes before backup generators kick in." Daniel nodded. "Do it." Luis and Jack slipped away into the shadows, their footsteps barely audible against the gravel. The rest of them waited, every second stretching thicker with tension. Then, the floodlights blinked out. A second later, a soft boom sounded in the distance, Luis's handiwork. And just like that, the Hollow Sun facility was plunged into darkness. Moving swiftly, Daniel led the team along the side of the main building. Hector guided them toward a loading dock entrance, one he remembered from his time inside the organization. As they slipped through the metal door, the cold hit them immediately. The air inside the facility was unnatural, a sterile, clinical chill that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. It smelled of antiseptic and decay, a mix that turned his stomach. Rows of dim emergency lights flickered on, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The place was far from abandoned. Hector motioned them forward. "Labs should be underground," he whispered. "That's where they keep the experiments." Leah inhaled sharply. "Experiments?" Hector hesitated. "You don't want to know." The hallway led them deeper into the facility, the air thickening with an unspoken dread. Then, they reached a large, reinforced door. Luis worked quickly, bypassing the electronic lock with a skill that spoke of years spent in the wrong places. The lock clicked, and Daniel slowly pushed the door open, and froze. The room beyond was lined with massive glass tanks. Inside each tank was a woman. Their bodies floated in a thick, clear liquid, their eyes closed, faces frozen in an unnatural stillness. Some had surgical scars along their arms and torsos, stitched together with metallic threads. A slow, rhythmic beeping filled the room, each tank connected to machines monitoring vitals, blood composition, and brain activity. It was a lab, a place where Hollow Sun had been creating something unnatural. Leah stepped forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "They're still alive," she whispered, her voice breaking. Daniel clenched his fists, rage bubbling beneath his skin. He had seen many things in his years on the force, but nothing like this. And then Hector found the files. On a metal table near the tanks sat stacks of documents, their pages covered in scientific jargon and medical reports. But one title stood out: Project L-23, the New Generation. Hector skimmed the papers, his expression growing darker with each line he read. "They're experimenting on women with a specific genetic anomaly." Daniel frowned. "What kind of anomaly?" Hector glanced at Leah. "One that she has." Leah's eyes widened. "What?" Hector laid the papers down. "They've been looking for someone like you for decades. Your DNA contains something unique, something they believe could create a new breed of humans." Daniel's blood ran cold. "A new breed?" Hector swallowed. "Stronger, more resistant to disease, maybe even capable of rapid regeneration." They weren't just experimenting, they were building something. And Leah was the key. A slow clap echoed through the lab. Daniel spun around, gun raised. A tall figure stepped out of the shadows, a man in a crisp black suit, too calm for someone whose operation was collapsing around him. His silver hair was slicked back, his face unreadable. "Impressive," the man mused. "I expected you much sooner." "Sheriff Hayes." Daniel's grip tightened. "And you are?" The man smiled. "Dr. Gabriel Thorne, founder of Hollow Sun, and, if I may be so bold, the future." Daniel's finger hovered over the trigger. "You're behind all of this?" Thorne tilted his head slightly. Behind? No, no, my dear sheriff. Ahead. His eyes flicked toward Leah, lingering just long enough to send a chill down Daniel's spine. You have no idea what she really is. Do you? Thorne mused. What she could become. What we could accomplish, together. Leah's hands clenched at her sides. I'm not your experiment. Thorne sighed, as if truly disappointed. Ah, but that's where you're wrong. You were never just Leah Briggs. You were chosen long before you even knew what you were. His gaze swept over the room. And now, you will fulfill your purpose. Then, he raised a hand, and the alarms blared. Doors along the walls burst open, and armed guards flooded in. Daniel didn't hesitate, he fired first. The lab erupted into chaos. Bullets slammed into metal, glass tanks shattered, spilling thick liquid across the floor. The women inside gasped for air, their fragile bodies collapsing onto the tiles. Leah ducked behind a console, hands over her ears as the gunfire roared around her. Luis took out 2 guards before diving for cover. Jack and Ryan fought their way toward the exit, trying to clear a path. And Daniel? He had only one target. Thorne stood untouched in the center of the chaos, watching with detached amusement. Daniel raised his gun, but Thorne just smiled. You don't kill the future, Sheriff, he murmured. And then, he vanished into the smoke. The battle was over seconds later. The guards who remained were either dead or unconscious, and the facility was in ruins. Daniel's breath came heavy as he scanned the wreckage. Leah sat slumped against the wall, her face pale. But Thorne was gone, and something told Daniel, this wasn't over. The sound of gunfire echoed through the dimly lit corridors of the Hollow Sun facility. Alarms wailed overhead, casting pulsing red light against the walls, while Daniel led Leah and his team deeper into the maze-like structure. The battle had begun, and there was no turning back. Luis fired a shot down the hall, taking out a guard before ducking behind a metal crate. We need an exit plan. Now. Daniel scanned the room. The only way out was through the main security gate, but the control room was heavily guarded. He turned to Hector. Can you shut down the doors remotely? Hector shook his head, reloading his weapon. No chance. Security's on lockdown. We either fight our way through or find another way. Leah, despite her weakened state, was changing. She was moving faster, her breathing steadier. The dizziness she had suffered just minutes ago seemed to be fading. Her skin, which had been pale and cold, now had a warmth to it. Daniel noticed her wounds from earlier, scratches from the chase, were already healing. He caught her gaze. Leah, are you feeling different? Leah hesitated, looking down at her hands. I don't know, she whispered. I just feel stronger. Daniel didn't have time to process it. More guards flooded in, cutting off their escape. The gunfire started again. They needed to move, now. Daniel made a split-second decision. Cover me, he barked as he darted toward a side corridor. His target, the control room. If he could override the security systems, they could get out before they were overwhelmed. Leah hesitated but followed him. Hector and Luis held their ground, keeping the guards occupied while Daniel and Leah sprinted through the corridors. The facility was a labyrinth, but Daniel's instincts led him to the right place. A massive steel door marked Command Center loomed ahead. Daniel fired at the keypad, sparks flying as the locking mechanism malfunctioned. The door slid open with a groan. Inside, Dr. Gabriel Thorne was waiting. The room was eerily quiet compared to the chaos outside. Monitors displayed live footage of the battle. Rows of computers hummed, running Hollow Sun's research programs. And at the center of it all stood Thorne, calm as ever, a pistol held loosely in his hand. You just couldn't leave well enough alone. Could you, Sheriff? Thorne sighed, shaking his head. Daniel leveled his gun. Shut it down, now. Thorne chuckled. You're making a mistake. Hayes. His eyes flicked to Leah. She belongs here. You don't understand what she really is. Leah clenched her fists, stepping forward. I know exactly what I am. A person, not your experiment. Thorne studied her for a moment, then smirked. Oh, Leah, he murmured. You don't even know the half of it. Daniel's grip tightened. What are you talking about? Thorne took a slow step forward, still completely unfazed. Didn't you ever wonder why she was different? Why we went to such lengths to find her? Daniel didn't answer, but the thought had been gnawing at him since Hector revealed Leah's past. Thorne motioned toward one of the monitors, displaying a genetic sequence. She is the first of her kind. A survivor. Every subject before her has failed. Their bodies rejected the change. But Leah, she adapts. Leah's breath hitched. You're lying. Thorne's smirk deepened. Aren't you already feeling it? Your body healing faster? Your senses sharpening? He gestured toward the gunfire still echoing outside. You don't need protection. My dear, you are the future. Daniel's stomach turned. Was it true? Had the drug they injected her with activated something dormant inside her? Leah's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from anger. I don't care what you think I am. She spat. I'm not a weapon. I'm not yours. Thorne sighed, almost disappointed. Then you leave me no choice. He raised his gun. Daniel reacted instantly. He fired first. The shot hit Thorne in the shoulder, sending him stumbling back, but he recovered too quickly. He was already moving, his gun aimed at Leah. Leah moved faster. Before Thorne could pull the trigger, she lunged at him with a speed no normal person should have. She slammed into him, knocking him off balance. Daniel saw the shock in Thorne's eyes as he realized she was stronger than she should be. Thorne gasped, blood dripping from his lips. His gun clattered to the floor. He looked at Leah, his expression shifting from arrogance to something else. Fascination. You really are the next step. He rasped. A shame I won't be here to see it. Then, with a final, ragged breath, he fell still. Alarms blared louder. The system was collapsing. Luisa's voice crackled through the radio. We gotta go. The place is rigged. Daniel grabbed Leah's arm. Time to move. She didn't resist. Whatever had just happened, whatever Thorne had revealed, it didn't matter right now. As they ran back through the corridors, the building trembled. Explosives had been set to destroy any remaining evidence. The team fought their way toward the exit. Fire, smoke, bullets. They pushed through it all. And then, they were out. They barely made it to a safe distance before the entire facility went up in flames. The explosion lit up the night sky, turning the desert into a sea of fire. Leah stared at the inferno, her breath ragged. Is it over? She whispered. Daniel didn't answer right away. His gut told him no. Hollow Sun was bigger than just one facility. Thorne may have been their leader, but who else was out there? And then there was Leah. What had they really done to her? He looked at her, saw the uncertainty in her eyes. He didn't have the answers yet, but he would find them. One way or another. The flames stretched high into the night sky, licking at the darkness as if trying to consume it whole. The Hollow Sun facility was collapsing in on itself. A graveyard of secrets burning away into nothing. The countdown had started. 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes before everything was gone. Daniel could feel the sweat dripping down the back of his neck as he half-carried, half-dragged Leah through the debris-strewn corridors. Behind them, Hector stumbled, one hand pressed against his side, blood seeping through his fingers. Luis and the others were ahead, clearing the way. Go, Hector gritted out, his breath ragged. Don't wait for me. Daniel ignored him, tightening his grip on Leah. Not a damn chance. The walls shook as another explosion ripped through the building, knocking them off balance. Leah winced, her body still weak, but there was something else, something changing in her. Her skin was warmer, her movements steadier. She shouldn't have been able to walk after what they'd put her through. But here she was, gripping Daniel's arm, her steps becoming firmer with every passing second. They were close, just a little farther. The exit was in sight. The cold desert air was a breath away. And then, gunfire. From the shadows of the collapsing hallway, Hollow Sun's final enforcers emerged. These weren't the usual hired guns. These men were different. Their movements were calculated, efficient. They had come prepared to eliminate everyone. One of them stepped forward, a scar running down the side of his face. He leveled his gun at Daniel. You should have walked away, Sheriff. He sneered. This didn't have to be your fight. Daniel exhaled sharply. His shoulder ached from the bullet wound he'd taken earlier. But he wasn't done. Yeah? Well, you should have picked an easier town. Then, chaos erupted. Bullets tore through the air. Luis and the others returned fire. But they were outnumbered. Hector gritted his teeth and pushed forward. dropping one of the enforcers with a clean shot before another round slammed into his chest. He staggered but didn't fall. Not yet. Daniel's gun clicked empty. He barely had time to process it before Leah moved, faster than she should have. She picked up a fallen pistol, her hands steady. The girl who had once been a victim, trembling behind a counter at a gas station, was gone. She fired, one shot, two, each one hitting its mark. The scar-faced enforcer's expression barely had time to register shock before he crumpled to the floor. Daniel stared at her, breathing heavy. Leah's hands trembled, but not from fear. She had changed. Something inside her had woken up, but they didn't have time to process it. Another explosion shook the ground beneath them. The walls cracked. Steel beams groaned under the pressure. They had seconds left. Daniel grabbed Leah's wrist, pulling her toward the exit. The others ran ahead, but Hector wasn't moving. Daniel turned back. Move your ass, Cruz. But Hector stayed where he was, slumping against the wall, a trail of blood marking his path. His face twisted in pain, but there was peace in his eyes. Not gonna make it, Hector muttered. He looked at Daniel, then at Leah. Get her out. Daniel's jaw clenched. He took a step forward, but Hector just shook his head. They'll keep coming, Hector said. His grip tightened around his gun. I'll hold him off. Luis yelled from outside. Daniel, now. Daniel cursed under his breath, his chest tightening. Then, Hector smirked, his old, cocky smirk, even with blood dripping from his lips. Do me a favor, he said. Make sure those bastards stay dead. And then, he turned. Gunfire erupted behind them as Hector held his ground, covering their escape. Daniel didn't look back. He couldn't. He and Leah burst through the exit just as the final explosion ripped through the facility. A shockwave hit them, throwing them forward onto the desert ground. Then, silence. Daniel pushed himself up, coughing through the dust. The facility was gone. Luis and the others stood nearby, their faces grim. They had won, but at a cost. Leah sat up beside him, her breaths coming fast. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the burning wreckage before them. Is it over? She whispered. Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at the flames, at the ruins of Hollow Sun. But then, a thought. Dr. Thorne had been the leader, but had he been the only one? Hollow Sun had operated in the shadows for decades. A facility could be rebuilt. A leader could be replaced. And then there was Leah. The changes in her weren't stopping. Her body was still adjusting, still transforming. What had they really done to her? Daniel clenched his fists. This wasn't over. Not yet. A week had passed since the fire consumed Hollow Sun. But for Daniel, the flames still burned in his mind. Gallup was quiet again. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, like something had been buried but never truly gone. The town had moved on. But Daniel knew the truth. The war wasn't over. Leah sat on the porch of Daniel's house, staring at her hands. The cuts and bruises from that night had disappeared too quickly. The ache in her ribs from where she'd been kicked, gone. She had seen the way Daniel looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. He was worried, because she wasn't normal anymore. At first, she thought it was just adrenaline, or maybe luck, but by the third day, the proof was undeniable. Her wounds closed faster than they should. Her reflexes sharpened. Her hearing was better. Her dreams felt real. She saw Hollow Sun in her sleep, cold corridors, whispering voices, and a name that wouldn't leave her head. L-23. She had asked Daniel about it once, but he had just clenched his jaw and said, "Forget it, Leah, it's over." But it wasn't. She felt it in her bones. And she wasn't the only one who knew. Daniel had expected the knock on his door. The government didn't just ignore things like this. Agent Michael Graves stepped inside like he already owned the place. His dark suit crisp, his gaze unreadable. He sat down at Daniel's table without waiting to be invited. "You made quite a mess out there, Sheriff," Graves said, tapping a file against the wooden surface. "The official report says Hollow Sun was a front for human trafficking. That you and a handful of vigilantes took it down. Very noble." Daniel leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "That what the official report says?" Graves smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's the version we're letting the public believe. But you and I both know that's not the whole story. Daniel didn't blink. Then why don't you tell me what you think happened? The agent flipped open the file, pulling out a photo. Leah, taken just days ago. She's not normal, is she? Graves mused. You've noticed it, haven't you? The healing, the reflexes. She's one of a kind. Daniel's jaw tightened. She's a kid who went through hell. That's all. Graves shook his head. No, Sheriff, that's not all. He leaned in. Hollow Sun wasn't just a bunch of sadistic scientists. They were working towards something. Leah was part of that. Daniel's fingers twitched, itching to grab the gun at his side. But Graves just sighed and closed the file. I'm not here to arrest you, Hayes. In fact, I'm giving you a chance. He slid a card across the table. There are people in high places who don't want this story getting out. You keep her quiet, keep yourself out of trouble, and this all disappears. Daniel stared at the card. A direct line, no name, just a number. And if I don't? Graves stood, adjusting his tie. Then she'll never be safe. That night, Leah sat by the window, the glow of the street lamp casting long shadows across the floor. She had been trying to sleep, but something felt off. Then she saw it. A single envelope, slipped under the front door. She swallowed hard, glancing toward Daniel's room. He was asleep. Slowly, she reached down, picking it up with trembling fingers. The paper was thick, expensive. When she flipped it over, there was no return address. Just 2 words. L23 lives. The blood drained from her face. They hadn't stopped. They were still watching, still waiting. Daniel drove through the empty highway, the desert stretching endlessly on both sides. The sky had turned a deep shade of orange, the sun dipping below the horizon. In the passenger seat, Leah sat in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Neither of them had spoken much since they left Gallup. There was nothing left to say. Leah knew why they were leaving. She had read the letter, seen the fear in Daniel's eyes when he found it. They were still watching. And as long as she stayed, no one in Gallup would ever be safe. She turned to Daniel. Where are we going? For now, far enough that they can't find you, he said, gripping the wheel a little tighter. A place where you can figure out who you are without them breathing down your neck. Leah exhaled slowly, looking back at the road ahead. She wasn't sure what scared her more, the idea that they would never stop hunting her, or the fact that she still didn't know what they wanted her to become. A few hours later, Daniel pulled up outside a small cabin in northern Arizona, nestled deep in the woods. It belonged to an old friend, someone Daniel trusted to keep secrets. Leah stepped out of the truck, looking around. So, this is it? For now, she swallowed. And what happens next? Daniel turned to face her. That's up to you. Leah hesitated before asking the question that had been haunting her since that night at Hollow Sun. Am I still Leah Briggs? Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. His voice was steady, certain. You're Leah, he said. No one gets to decide that for you. Her chest tightened at his words. She wanted to believe him. She really did. Daniel left Leah at the cabin and drove back toward town alone. The road felt heavier without her sitting next to him. He knew this wouldn't be forever. They would come for her again. And when they did, she would need to be ready. When he arrived home, the air felt wrong. The front door, it was open. Daniel's hand went to his gun as he stepped inside. The house was still, too still. Then he saw it, sitting neatly on his kitchen table. A manila folder, no return address, no markings, just a single line of text stamped in red on the front. Project L23 Phase 2 initiated. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He flipped open the folder. Inside were names, locations, and photographs. More girls. Just like Leah, the project hadn't ended. It had just begun again. Leah thought she had escaped. Daniel thought he had won. But Hollow Sun was just one part of something much bigger. Daniel clenched his jaw as he stared at the file. Knowing what this meant, he had a choice. Let her go and hope she stayed hidden. Or go after them before they could ever come for her again. He already knew the answer. With a deep breath, Daniel picked up his phone and made the call. I need a team, he said. This isn't over. Somewhere, far from Gallup. Leah looked up at the sky. feeling a cold shiver crawl up her spine. She didn't know why, but she knew one thing. They were coming. Some truths are too dangerous to stay buried. Leah thought she was just a girl trying to survive. But she became the key to something far bigger, something the world wasn't ready for. And Daniel, he proved that sometimes the fight for justice isn't about winning, but about refusing to look away. The darkness may not be gone, but as long as there are those willing to stand against it, hope will never die. What would you do if the truth put you in danger? Would you run, or would you fight? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Shadow Secrets, because some stories are too thrilling to miss.